Somewhere right now, a teenager is lying in bed at 2 in the morning, thumb moving across a glowing screen, unable to stop, even though some quiet part of her knows she should. She is not weak. She is not broken. She is, in fact, responding exactly the way her brain was built to respond to a system engineered by some of the most brilliant minds of our generation. And that is the most unsettling part of this story. Because what if the very people who built the apps on your home screen never set out to help you connect at all? What if, from the very beginning, the goal was something else entirely, to capture your attention, hold it hostage, and sell it to the highest bidder, one dopamine hit at a time? To understand how we got here, we have to go back to a small room at Harvard University in the 1950s, where a psychologist named B.F. Skinner placed a pigeon inside a box. The pigeon could peck a lever, and sometimes food would appear. But Skinner discovered something strange. When the food came every single time the pigeon pecked, the bird would eventually grow bored and stop. But when the food came randomly, unpredictably, sometimes after 1 peck, sometimes after 20, the pigeon would peck compulsively, obsessively, unable to walk away. Skinner called this a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, and it remains, to this day, one of the most powerful behavioral triggers known to psychology. It is the same principle that keeps a gambler feeding coins into a slot machine long after common sense says, stop. And decades later, this exact mechanism would be quietly built into the palm of your hand. Every time you pull down on your phone to refresh a feed, every time you check to see if someone liked your post, every time a notification appears without warning, you are, in a very real sense, that pigeon in the box. You never know what you're going to get. Maybe it is nothing. Maybe it is a message from someone you love. Maybe it is 100 likes on a photo you were nervous to post. The unpredictability is not an accident. It is the entire architecture. And once you understand that, you can never look at your phone quite the same way again. But to understand why the system works so devastatingly well on the human brain, we need to go even deeper into the ancient neural wiring that governs desire itself. At the center of your brain sits a structure called the nucleus accumbens, part of what neuroscientists call the mesolimbic reward pathway. For hundreds of thousands of years, this system existed for one purpose: survival. It rewarded our ancestors with a chemical called dopamine whenever they found food, secured a mate, or strengthened a bond with their tribe. Dopamine is often mistakenly called the pleasure chemical, but researchers who study the brain's reward circuitry describe something more precise and, frankly, more dangerous. Dopamine is not about pleasure, it is about wanting. It is the chemical of anticipation, the neurological whisper that says, keep going, something good might be just around the corner. It is released not when we receive a reward, but in the moments leading up to it, in the reaching, the checking, the hoping. This is precisely why the pull to refresh gesture, invented for a mobile app in 2009, spread across nearly every social platform on Earth within a few short years. It mimics the exact motion of a slot machine lever. Each pull is a tiny act of gambling, a bet placed on the unknown, and your brain, still running on prehistoric software, cannot tell the difference between checking for a lion in the grass and checking for a new comment on your photo. The stakes feel different. The neurochemistry does not. Now imagine an entire industry built by people who understood this neuroscience intimately and who had one central objective: to maximize the amount of time you spend inside their product. This idea has a name inside Silicon Valley. It is called capturing attention, and for the better part of the last 2 decades, attention has been the single most valuable currency on the internet. Not because anyone particularly cares about your eyeballs, but because attention converts directly into advertising revenue. The longer you stay, the more ads you see, the more data you generate, and the more money flows toward companies whose entire business model depends on you never quite feeling satisfied enough to log off. Some of the very engineers and executives who helped build these systems have since come forward with startling admissions. Former insiders from major platforms have publicly described how design meetings centered not around user well-being, but around a single chilling question: how do we consume as much of this person's time and conscious attention as possible? One prominent early architect of a major social network later admitted in public interviews that the platform was deliberately engineered to exploit a vulnerability in human psychology, specifically our craving for social validation, and that the creators understood this and built the product anyway. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a documented shift in how an entire industry began treating human attention as a resource to be mined, refined, and sold, much like oil or gold, except the oil field, in this case, was the human mind. So how exactly do you engineer a product that exploits the need for social validation? You start with the like button, introduced in its now familiar form around 2009. On the surface, it seems innocent, even wholesome. A small thumbs up, a tiny red heart, but underneath, the like button triggers one of the oldest and most powerful psychological needs a human being has: the need to belong, to be seen, to matter to others. Evolutionary psychologists point out that for most of human history, social rejection was not just emotionally painful, it was a death sentence. Being cast out of the tribe meant losing access to food, protection, and reproduction. Our brains evolved a threat detection system for social exclusion so sensitive that neuroimaging studies have found social rejection activates some of the same neural regions as physical pain. This means, in a very real neurological sense, being ignored online can hurt like a wound. Knowing this, the architects of social media built systems that turn belonging into a quantifiable, addictive metric. Suddenly, self-worth could be measured in real time, displayed publicly, and updated by the second. A photo posted without enough likes within the first hour could trigger genuine anxiety. Researchers studying adolescent psychology have found that many teenagers will delete a post entirely if it fails to gather sufficient approval quickly enough, a behavior that reveals just how deeply the platform's feedback loop has fused with a young person's sense of identity. And here is where the story grows darker still, because the algorithms behind these platforms are not neutral. They learn. They watch what keeps you scrolling, what makes you pause, what makes your thumb hesitate for even a fraction of a second longer than usual, and then they give you more of exactly that. This is where dark psychology enters the picture in its most literal sense. The recommendation systems behind major platforms are trained using massive data sets and machine learning models with a single optimization target: engagement, not happiness, not truth, not connection, engagement. And it turns out, across study after study in behavioral science, that the content most reliably capable of capturing human attention is not content that makes us feel calm or content. It is content that makes us feel outrage, fear, envy, or arousal. Researchers analyzing the spread of information across social networks have found that emotionally charged content, particularly content that provokes anger, spreads dramatically faster and farther than neutral or positive content. The algorithm does not know it is doing this maliciously. It has simply learned, through relentless trial and error across billions of users, that outrage keeps people watching, and so without any single person explicitly deciding it should be this way. Entire recommendation systems have quietly evolved into engines optimized to make us angry, anxious, and endlessly hooked, because those emotional states are, tragically, the most profitable ones. This raises an uncomfortable question that researchers, ethicists, and former tech insiders have been grappling with for years. Global scale, who bears responsibility? Is it the engineers who built the algorithm, the executives who approved it, the advertisers? Who fund it? Or is it something more diffuse and unsettling? An emergent property of an economic system that rewards attention capture above all else, with no single villain to point to, only a machine that learned to exploit us, because exploiting us was, mathematically, the most efficient path to growth? To understand the true cost of this system, we have to look at what it is doing to the developing brain, particularly in adolescence, whose prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and emotional regulation, does not finish developing until roughly the mid-20s. This means that the very population most active on social media is also the population least biologically equipped to resist its most manipulative design features. Longitudinal studies tracking adolescent mental health alongside rising smartphone and social media use have documented significant increases in reported loneliness, anxiety, and depressive symptoms beginning in the early 2010s, a period that closely tracks the mass adoption of smartphones among teenagers. Researchers are careful to note that correlation is not the same as proven causation, and the scientific community continues to debate the precise strength of this relationship. But several controlled studies have found that when participants voluntarily reduce their social media use for a period of just a few weeks, they report measurable improvements in mood, self-esteem, and life satisfaction, suggesting the platforms are not merely reflecting existing distress, but actively contributing to it. One particularly striking phenomenon researchers have identified is social comparison at a scale never before possible in human history. For nearly all of human evolution, our ancestors compared themselves to perhaps a few dozen people within their immediate tribe or village. Today, a teenage girl scrolling through her feed for 20 minutes might unconsciously compare her body, her life, her achievements, and her happiness against curated, filtered, algorithmically selected highlight reels from a impossibly perfect. Psychologists call this upward social comparison, and while a small amount can be motivating, chronic exposure at this scale has been linked in multiple studies to body dissatisfaction, disordered eating patterns, and diminished self-worth, particularly among adolescent girls. Internal research from at least one major platform, later made public through investigative reporting and congressional testimony, reportedly found that the company's own studies showed a meaningful percentage of teenage users, especially teenage girls, felt worse about their bodies after using the platform, and that the company was aware of these findings for a significant period before they became public knowledge. Whether or not every detail of those internal findings has been independently verified remains a subject of ongoing scrutiny, but the broader pattern they describe aligns closely with a substantial and growing body of independent academic research. But social comparison is only one thread in a much larger tapestry of psychological manipulation woven into these platforms, because we have not yet talked about fear, and specifically, the fear of missing out, a phenomenon so pervasive it has earned its own acronym, FOMO, and its own line of academic study. FOMO taps into a deep evolutionary anxiety about social exclusion, the same ancient wiring that once warned our ancestors they might be left behind by the group during a hunt or migration. Social media transforms this ancient anxiety into a constant, low-grade hum of unease. Every story you have not watched, every group chat you are not part of, every party you were not invited to but can now see in vivid detail becomes a small psychological wound. Reopened daily, sometimes hourly. Some researchers argue this manufactured urgency is precisely why features like disappearing stories, always displayed with a countdown, were introduced. If content vanishes in 24 hours, you're compelled to check now, not later, training your behavior around the platform's schedule rather than your own. And then there is the infinite scroll, a design feature first introduced in the early 2000s and now nearly universal, which removes the natural stopping cues that once existed in older media. When you read a physical newspaper or watched broadcast television, there were built-in endpoints, the back page, the end of the program, moments that gently signaled, "This is enough, you may stop now." The infinite scroll deliberately eliminates these endpoints. There is always more content one flick away, and this seemingly small decision has been described by cognitive scientists as one of the most psychologically consequential interface choices in the history of computing, because it removes the natural friction that once helped human beings regulate their consumption of, well, almost anything. This engineered frictionlessness connects to something researchers increasingly describe using the language of addiction itself, a term it is important to be precise here. As of now, major diagnostic manuals like the DSM do not formally recognize social media addiction as a distinct clinical disorder, though internet gaming disorder has been included as a condition warranting further study. However, a growing body of neuroimaging research has found that individuals who report compulsive social media use show brain activity patterns during platform use, particularly in reward-related regions, that bear striking similarities to patterns observed in individuals with substance use disorders and gambling addiction. This does not prove social media is chemically identical to a drug. It suggests instead that the same neural circuitry, the same reward pathways that evolved to keep us alive, can be hijacked by sufficiently well-designed digital systems, whether or not any substance ever enters the body. Now, let us step back and ask a deeper, more unsettling question, one that takes us beyond individual psychology and into the realm of collective human behavior. What happens to a society when billions of people are simultaneously immersed for hours a day in systems engineered to maximize outrage, comparison, and compulsive checking? Social. Psychologists studying polarization have found that algorithmically curated feeds, by consistently surfacing content that confirms existing beliefs and provokes strong emotional reactions, may be accelerating a phenomenon known as affective polarization, where people do not merely disagree with those holding opposing views, but increasingly view them with genuine distrust, even contempt. Some researchers describe this as an unintended consequence of engagement optimization, a system built to maximize watch time, inadvertently reshaping the emotional and political fabric of entire nations. Others caution against overstating this effect, noting that polarization has multiple causes extending well beyond any single technology, and that isolating social media's precise contribution remains scientifically challenging. Still, the fact that this debate is happening at all, at the scale of entire democracies, reveals just how far the consequences of these design choices have traveled from their original, seemingly simple purpose of connecting friends and family. There's also a darker chapter in this story, one involving what psychologists call dark patterns. Interface design choices deliberately crafted to manipulate users into behaviors they might not otherwise choose. Consider the deceptively simple act of trying to delete your account on certain platforms, a process that on some services has historically been buried under multiple menus, guilt-inducing messages showing photos of friends who will supposedly miss you, and delays clearly designed to make quitting as psychologically and logistically difficult as possible, while creating an account often takes mere seconds. Consider autoplaying videos that begin before you have consciously decided to keep watching, effectively making inaction, doing nothing at all, the path that leads to continued consumption. Consider notification badges, those small red circles with white numbers, engineered using the same principles as a doorbell that will not stop ringing until answered, exploiting what psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect, our brain's documented tendency to fixate on unfinished tasks far more than completed ones. Each of these design choices, studied individually, might seem minor, even reasonable. Together, layered across a product used by billions of people multiple times a day, they form a system of extraordinary psychological sophistication, built not by any single mastermind, but through years of iterative testing, data analysis, and relentless optimization toward one number: time spent in app. And yet, here is where the story refuses to remain simply bleak. Because human beings are not merely passive victims of their own neurochemistry, awareness itself changes behavior. Once you understand that a notification is engineered using the same psychological principles as a slot machine, once you understand that infinite scroll is a deliberate removal of natural stopping cues, once you understand that your anxiety while scrolling may be manufactured rather than organic, something shifts. Researchers studying digital well-being interventions have found that even simple changes, turning notifications to grayscale, removing badge numbers, setting deliberate time limits, can meaningfully reduce compulsive checking behavior, precisely because they interrupt the automatic unconscious pathways these platforms were designed to exploit. This is not a call to abandon technology altogether, nor is that a remotely realistic proposition for a species that has, for better and worse, woven digital connection into nearly every aspect of modern life. It is instead a call for something psychologists refer to as digital literacy, an understanding of the mechanisms at play, sophisticated enough to allow genuine choice rather than unconscious compulsion. There is also a broader reckoning now underway within the technology industry itself, one worth watching closely as it unfolds. In recent years, growing public awareness, congressional hearings, investigative journalism, and internal whistleblower testimony have pushed several major platforms to introduce features explicitly designed to counteract the very psychological mechanisms they once optimized for, including screen time dashboards, gentle reminders to take a break, and adjustments to recommendation algorithms intended to reduce exposure to some categories of harmful content, whether these changes represent a genuine shift in priorities or calculated public relations. Response to mounting pressure remains a matter of legitimate debate among researchers, journalists, and former industry insiders themselves. Regulatory bodies in multiple countries have begun proposing or passing legislation aimed at protecting younger users specifically, reflecting a broader societal recognition that the developing adolescent brain may require protections that adult users, at least in principle, are better equipped to navigate on their own. This is an evolving legal and ethical landscape, not a settled one, and how it develops over the coming years will likely shape the digital environment an entire generation grows up inside. Which brings us finally to the question that matters most, not as an abstract policy debate, but as something deeply personal. If your brain evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to seek connection, belonging, and social approval, and if modern technology has learned to simulate and exploit those exact ancient needs with a precision no previous generation ever had to contend with, what does it actually mean to live well in a world built this way? Some psychologists argue the answer lies not in willpower alone, since willpower is a famously limited and unreliable resource when pitted against systems engineered by teams of behavioral scientists with virtually unlimited resources. Instead, they point toward environmental design, restructuring your own relationship with technology so that healthier choices become the path of least resistance, rather than relying on moment-to-moment self-discipline to overcome an interface built specifically to overwhelm it. Others emphasize the importance of rebuilding what researchers call attentional sovereignty, a conscious reclaiming of one's own focus and emotional state from systems designed to auction it off to the highest bidder. What remains certain across every study, every insider account, every neuroimaging scan of a brain lit up by anticipation before a notification even arrives is this: the device in your pocket was not built by accident. Its most compelling features were not the product of guesswork, but of some of the most rigorous applied psychology and neuroscience research in human history, aimed not at helping you flourish, but at capturing and holding your attention for as long as possible. This does not make you foolish for feeling its pull. It makes you human, wired by millions of years of evolution to respond to social signals, novelty, and unpredictable reward in ways that once kept your ancestors alive and are now, in a strange and unsettling twist of history, being used to keep you scrolling. The question that remains, the one that will likely define the coming decades of psychology, technology, and public health, is whether human beings can learn to consciously outmaneuver systems built by other human beings to exploit the deepest wiring of the human mind, or whether we are entering an era where the most sophisticated persuasion technology ever created will always, quietly, be one step ahead of our own. Self-awareness. The pigeon in Skinner's box never understood why it could not stop pecking the liver. It simply could not resist the pull of the unknown. The uncomfortable question hanging over all of us now in an age where nearly every adult and child on Earth carries a version of that same box in their pocket is whether understanding the mechanism is enough to finally set us free, or whether some part of us, quietly, late at night, thumb hovering over the screen, already knows the answer.